What if I told you the most powerful lesson in faith wasn't found in a miracle, but in a man who lost everything? What if your deepest suffering wasn't a sign that God abandoned you, but a stage where heaven and hell are watching to see if you'll stand? This is not just a story. This is a revelation, one that religion rarely dares to explore. We've been told faith is about blessings, answered prayers, protection. But Job's life shatters that illusion. He was faithful and still lost it all: children, wealth, health, even his reputation. And yet, in the ashes of agony, he did the unthinkable. He worshipped. He didn't fake a smile. He fell to the ground and praised the very God who allowed the storm. In this video, you're about to witness the untold depths of the book of Job. Not as a distant Bible tale, but as a spiritual roadmap for anyone who's ever asked, why me? It's raw, emotional, and uncomfortable. But it will show you the kind of faith that makes hell tremble and makes heaven roar, because Job didn't just survive. He revealed what unshakable trust looks like. And once you understand his journey, you'll never see your suffering the same way again. So stay with me until the end, because buried in this story is a key, one that could unlock your peace, your power, and your purpose. Are you ready to uncover the greatest spiritual lesson ever told? Job wasn't just any man. He was deeply upright, devout, and committed to turning away from evil. He lived with a spiritual awareness most people never reach, honoring God in his thoughts, words, and decisions. His wealth was immense. His family was large and united, and his name was respected across the land. But his greatest strength wasn't what he owned. It was the inner faith that anchored it all. Job lived as if every moment had eternal consequences. Every morning, Job rose early to make burnt offerings for his children, just in case they had sinned in their hearts. Not because he feared God as a tyrant, but because he revered God as holy. He understood that the spiritual realm never sleeps, and true faith isn't passive, it's active, alert, intentional. While others lived by routine, Job lived by divine responsibility. He covered his household in prayer like armor before a storm. Imagine having everything, yet clinging not to wealth, but to the one who gave it. That was the essence of Job. His riches didn't own him, his devotion did. He didn't see success as something to be flaunted, but as something to steward for God's glory. And it wasn't by chance. It was cultivated through daily communion, gratitude, and humility. Job's life was a living altar. But such integrity never goes unnoticed in the spiritual world. While Job's neighbors admired his fortune, a darker presence saw something else, a challenge. Satan, the accuser, had his eyes on Job, not because of what Job had, but because of what Job believed. True righteousness threatens darkness more than any sermon, and Job's faith was a light too bright to ignore. The prosperity of Job was not a reward, it was a test in disguise, because sometimes the enemy doesn't attack when you're weak, but when you're strongest. Job's wealth, his family, his influence, they weren't just blessings, they were pressure points, and Satan, ancient and strategic, was about to press them. Not to break Job's body, but to break his spirit. This is the beginning of a cosmic trial that would shake the heavens. A man, unaware of the battle brewing in eternity, living in peace, about to be thrust into a storm he didn't ask for. Yet the foundation had already been laid. Job wasn't just rich in gold, he was rich in faith. And that, not his cattle or coins, was the true threat to hell's agenda. And now the question begins to rise like thunder in the distance. What happens when faith is stripped of comfort? When worship costs everything, can a man still believe when the blessings disappear? That question will not only define Job's life, but offer a lesson the world still hasn't forgotten. Far beyond the reach of human understanding, a scene unfolds in the spiritual realm. An assembly before the throne of God. Among the heavenly beings walks a figure that does not belong in the light. Satan. He appears not with reverence, but with accusation in his heart. God, in divine sovereignty, asks him where he's been, though he already knows. Satan answers with cunning calm, roaming the earth, going back and forth in it. Then comes the divine challenge, unexpected yet deliberate. Have you considered my servant Job? It's not a question of curiosity, but of confidence. God points to Job not as a favored pet, but as a proven vessel. There is no one like him on earth, he declares, blameless and upright. Heaven honors this man, but hell is provoked by him. And Satan, unable to deny Job's righteousness, tries to corrupt its motive. With venom masked as logic, Satan lays his accusation. Does Job fear God for nothing? It's a bold claim that Job's faith is a transaction, not a conviction, that his loyalty exists because it profits him. Strip away the blessings, Satan argues, and Job will curse God to his face. This isn't just about Job, it's about the nature of faith itself. Is it real if it costs nothing? Shockingly, God grants Satan permission, but with limits. Very well, he says, everything he has is in your power, but do not lay a finger on the man himself. And with that divine boundary, the test is set in motion. God isn't absent, he's involved, even in the permission of trial, because real faith is not forged in comfort, it's revealed in fire. Job, still unaware, has just become the center of a cosmic battle. Notice what this means. God believes in Job's heart more than Satan believes in his fall, and that is powerful. God didn't put Job on display to watch him fail, but to silence the enemy with one man's unwavering trust. The throne room falls silent, and the enemy descends to earth, ready to shatter a life built on obedience, not with swords, but with loss, not with demons, but with despair. This moment in Scripture lifts the veil on spiritual warfare. Sometimes your trials aren't punishments, they're compliments. When God knows your faith is real, he may allow it to be tested, not to harm you, but to expose its depth. And Satan, the great accuser, still prowls looking for the faithful to challenge. What he fears most isn't your prosperity, it's your unshakable worship. And so begins the unraveling of Job's world, not because he sinned, not because he doubted, but because heaven trusted him and hell envied him. A test unlike any other is coming, not to punish but to prove, and Job is about to lose everything, except the one thing that matters most. The first blow strikes like lightning on a clear day. A servant runs to Job, breathless and trembling. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys grazing nearby when the Sabaeans attacked and took them, and they killed the servants with the sword. Before the words can even settle, another servant arrives. Fire from the sky, burning the sheep and more servants. The news comes like punches to the soul, fast, sharp, relentless. Before Job can even grieve the first two losses, a third messenger appears. The Chaldeans have raided the camels and massacred yet more of Job's men. Everything that once symbolized strength and provision is vanishing. His wealth, his structure, his earthly security, it's collapsing like a tower in an earthquake. But even this devastation is not the deepest cut Satan has prepared. The final messenger arrives, and his words pierce deeper than any blade. Your sons and daughters were feasting, when suddenly a mighty wind struck the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, all of them, in a moment. No time for goodbye, no explanation, just silence. The kind of silence that only follows a soul-shattering scream. And Job stands up. He tears his robe and shaves his head, ancient symbols of mourning, but also of surrender. Then, in the dust of grief, he falls to the ground, not in defeat, but in worship. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. This isn't religious habit. This is faith in its rawest, most sacred form. Job doesn't pretend it doesn't hurt. He doesn't dismiss the pain. He walks straight into it, carrying his broken heart to God instead of away from him. That's the difference. That's the kind of faith hell cannot predict. Anyone can believe when life is good, but Job shows us something heaven already knew. Real faith weeps and still worships. In all this, Scripture says, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. This single line shakes every shallow version of belief we've built. Job's loss was unspeakable, yet he did not turn his back. He didn't need answers to remain anchored. His soul was tied to something deeper than blessing. It was tied to the giver himself. And now we must ask ourselves, what would we do if we lost everything? Could we still say, "Blessed be his name"? Could we fall to our knees, not in bitterness, but in reverence? Job's tragedy is not over, but his response has already echoed through eternity. Yet as dark as this moment is, a deeper trial still awaits. Just when it seems Job has endured the worst, the enemy strikes again. This time, not his possessions, not his family, but his flesh. Pain enters his own body as Satan afflicts him with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. His skin becomes his prison, itching, festering, breaking. The man once seated among kings now sits in ashes, scraping himself with broken pottery. The contrast is unbearable. Job's physical suffering is humiliating and dehumanizing. Once a pillar of health and respect, he is now the subject of whispers and pity. He's not just in pain, he's alone in it. The silence of his servants, the fear in the eyes of those who pass by, the stench of infection, all become part of his new daily torment. His body, once strong and blessed, becomes a battlefield of agony and shame. And then his wife speaks. Her words are sharp, cutting deeper than the sores. "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." It's not rebellion, it's despair speaking. She, too, has lost everything. Her cry isn't just anger, it's grief twisted by hopelessness. Job, disfigured and grieving, hears in her voice the echo of every human temptation. Give up, let it go, just break. But Job answers with quiet power, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" His voice doesn't roar, it holds. Even now, he doesn't deny his pain, but he refuses to curse the God he has walked with all his life. This isn't blind optimism, it's conviction. He knows God owes him nothing, and yet, Job still believes, not in comfort, in character, in covenant. Imagine this moment. Imagine the weight of pain, the whispers of death, the loneliness of being misunderstood, even by the one closest to you. Job is not just physically broken, his soul is being tested at the deepest level. It's not about wounds on the skin, it's about wounds of the spirit. And still, Job doesn't curse God. His silence becomes louder than any shout. The scriptures say, in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Every sentence carries divine weight. Because it's not just about what Job suffers, it's about how he responds. This man, who has every reason to walk away, chooses to stay, not because it's easy, but because something eternal burns within him, something hell still cannot understand. But this is not the end of the breaking. The pain has only begun to attract witnesses. Friends are coming, not to help, but to interpret his suffering. And soon, what was a personal tragedy will become a public debate. The silence of God will echo louder, and Job will have to decide whether faith can survive not just loss, but misunderstanding. 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, hear of Job's suffering and come to see him. From a distance, they barely recognize him. His body, his face, his posture, everything is unrecognizable. When they finally reach him, they don't speak a word. Instead, they sit with him in silence for 7 days and nights. No advice, no correction, just shared sorrow. There's something sacred about that silence. In a world quick to speak, to diagnose, to explain pain, these men begin with presence. Sometimes, silence is the most spiritual response to suffering. Words often try to fix what only love can carry. For 7 days, they embody empathy until they open their mouths. What begins as comfort slowly turns into interrogation. One by one, they begin to suggest a dark idea. Job, you must have sinned. Eliphaz appeals to experience. Bildad defends God's justice. Zophar invokes moral law. All agree on one thing: suffering must be the result of guilt. Their theology is clean, but cold. Job listens, then responds not with pride, but with protest. I have not sinned, he says. My hands are clean. His words aren't arrogant, they're anguished. He's not defending his ego. He's defending his relationship with God, the God he thought he knew, the God who now seems silent in his darkest hour. And that silence, more than the sores, is what cuts deepest. The debates intensify, circling around ideas of justice, retribution, and divine fairness. The friends speak like preachers, confident and composed, but Job speaks like a man bleeding, crying out for understanding. Why me is not just a question. It's a plea for meaning, for connection, for God to speak. This section of Job is uncomfortable because it sounds like us. When things fall apart, how quickly we search for reasons, how often we accuse ourselves or others just to make pain logical. But some suffering doesn't come with explanations, it comes with invitations to deeper trust, to a more mysterious walk with God. The silence between Job and God still holds, but in that void, something is stirring. Job refuses to curse. He refuses to pretend. He stands between heaven and earth, misunderstood by men and unanswered by God. And now, a younger voice begins to rise, one that challenges both Job and his accusers. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like Job, misunderstood, tested, or even abandoned? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might give someone else the strength to hold on. Let's create a space of honesty, healing, and faith together. Job's voice grows stronger, not because his pain lessens, but because his spirit refuses to be silenced. He speaks not with polished theology, but with raw truth. I cry out to you, God, he says, but you do not answer. His words are not blasphemy. They are intimacy, the kind that only grows in fire. Job isn't accusing God. He's pleading for understanding. His friends, however, double down. The more Job insists on his innocence, the more they suspect pride. They believe their system must be right. Blessing follows righteousness. Suffering follows sin. But Job doesn't fit the formula, and that unnerves them. So they accuse, repeatedly, harshly, and in doing so, they become agents of shame rather than comfort. Job's speeches are poetic and piercing. He describes his pain, his memories, his longing for death. He mourns not only the loss of his children, but of his reputation, his purpose, his place in the world. I was eyes to the blind, he says, remembering his days of honor. Now I am a joke to my friends. His identity has been stripped bare, and still he speaks. These chapters are Job's heart on display. We see a man wrestling not just with God, but with himself. He is both faithful and frustrated, believing and bewildered. This isn't a sanitized version of faith. It's real, human, trembling faith. He is honest with his wounds, and that honesty becomes its own kind of worship. What makes Job extraordinary isn't that he has no questions, but that he brings them to God. He doesn't turn his back. He leans in, even while bleeding. He cries, he shouts, he argues, but always toward heaven. That posture is what separates Job from bitterness. He may not understand God's silence, but he refuses to walk away from it. Meanwhile, his friends become more rigid. They are uncomfortable with mystery, with pain they cannot label. They need answers more than they need truth, and in doing so, they miss the deeper story unfolding before their eyes. God is not absent. He is watching, listening, waiting for something only the fire can reveal. And just when it seems the voices are exhausted, a new one speaks, younger, fiery, uninvited, but attentive. Elihu has been listening all along, and now, with humility and boldness, he steps forward, not to shame Job, but to reframe everything they thought they knew about pain and purpose. Elihu, the youngest among them, had remained silent out of respect for the elders. But now the time comes for him to speak, burning with righteous anger, not against Job's pain, but against the arrogance in the words of both Job and his friends. He accuses the three friends of failing to truly answer Job, and Job himself for justifying himself rather than God. His voice cuts through the stale arguments like a fresh wind through a closed room. Elihu's words don't echo tradition, they awaken insight. Unlike the others, Elihu doesn't insist Job is wicked, but he insists Job has become proud in his defense. He offers a new possibility, that suffering may not always be punishment, it may be correction, instruction, preparation, a divine whisper through hardship. God speaks in many ways, Elihu says, though man may not perceive it. It's a revolutionary thought, that pain might carry a purpose beyond retribution, that maybe, just maybe, there's more to God's plan than comfort. Elihu's perspective brings a shift. He highlights God's greatness, not to silence Job, but to expand his understanding. He speaks of clouds, storms, lightning, and the breath of God moving through nature. He paints a world infused with divine mystery, where God is not just judge, but teacher, where trials are not always punishment, but pathways to transformation. Elihu's words aren't perfect, but they prepare the stage for something holy. He challenges Job to see beyond himself, to humble his heart and wait for God's response. He reminds him and us that just because God is silent doesn't mean he is absent, that divine timing and human desperation rarely align. Be patient, Elihu urges, for God is mighty in power and understanding. It's not a rebuke, it's an invitation to let go of the need to be right and simply be open. Through Elihu, we begin to see that God's voice isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides in the margins of suffering, in dreams, in discomfort, in delay. He delivers the afflicted by their affliction, Elihu says. It's paradoxical, yet profoundly true, that the very thing that breaks us might also be what saves us. Elihu reframes pain not as divine abandonment, but as divine attention. And perhaps this is why God allows Elihu to speak last, not to correct Job's faith, but to clear the air, to prepare his heart for the thunder that's coming, for soon God himself will answer, not through a dream or a prophet or even fire from heaven, but through the very element that mirrors Job's storm-tossed soul, a whirlwind. The silence is ending, but Job doesn't know that yet. All he hears is a young man speaking of mysteries he's not sure he can believe. And still, something in Job begins to shift. An inner stillness, a trembling expectation. The stage is set. The dust is rising, and from the whirlwind, God is about to speak. Then, without warning, it happens. God speaks, not through fire, not through earthquake, but through a whirlwind. The very storm that mirrors Job's soul now becomes the voice of the Almighty. But he doesn't answer Job's questions. He questions Job instead. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? His voice doesn't explain. It reveals. It humbles. It awakens awe. God's response is not a lecture, but a revelation. He paints pictures of the universe, oceans held back by invisible doors, morning light stretching across the land, animals cared for by unseen hands. Job had cried for justice, but God shows him mystery. He shifts the focus from Job's pain to his power, not to diminish Job, but to remind him who holds the stars in place. It's not cruelty, it's clarity. God isn't ignoring Job's suffering, he's enlarging his vision. Sometimes the answer to our pain is not found in reason, but in reverence. Have you given the horse its strength? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? These divine questions are not accusations, they are invitations to trust deeper, to see how little we understand. Job listens, broken and breathless. His pain doesn't vanish, but his pride begins to melt. The God he longed to debate now stands before him, not as a distant judge, but as the creator of all. And Job's soul bows low. I spoke of things I did not understand, he says, things too wonderful for me to know. This is not surrender from weakness, it's surrender from awakening. God's speech stretches for chapters, yet not once does he mention Job's suffering directly. And still, every word is for Job, because sometimes what we need isn't comfort, it's perspective, not soothing words, but sacred wonder. God doesn't solve the mystery, he becomes the mystery. And in that, Job finds peace. This moment is the climax of the story, not the restoration, but the revelation. Job's questions mattered, but God's presence mattered more. Pain had clouded Job's view, but the whirlwind cleared it. He no longer demands answers. He beholds the one who holds all answers, and that seeing, that encounter, is more healing than any resolution. But God is not done yet. There are others who have spoken falsely, and he intends to set the record straight. Job has been vindicated, not by winning an argument, but by remaining faithful in confusion. And now, the same God who allowed the storm prepares to restore what the storm took. After the whirlwind, God turns to Job's friends, not with silence, but with judgment. He tells Eliphaz, "You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." Their theological confidence is exposed as arrogance. They are told to make a sacrifice, and, this is key, Job must pray for them. The man they condemned is now their intercessor. Grace flows not just to Job, but through him. Job's restoration doesn't begin with wealth. It begins with forgiveness. He prays for his friends, not with bitterness, but with release. That act of mercy becomes the turning point. Scripture says, "The Lord restored his fortunes when he prayed for his friends." Restoration begins when pride ends. When Job lets go of vindication and steps into grace, the heavens open again. Then the blessings return, not as compensation, but as a divine echo of restoration. Job receives twice as much as he had before, thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys. But more than riches, he is surrounded again by love. His brothers and sisters, once distant, now return. They comfort him, and each one brings a gift. His home, once silent with grief, begins to breathe again. Job's wife, whose words once trembled with despair, stands beside him in this new chapter. Together they build again, and God gives him 7 sons and 3 daughters, the most beautiful in the land. He names them with prophetic beauty, Jemimah, Keziah, and Karen Hapush, names that speak of peace, fragrance, and radiance. His lineage continues, not just in blood, but in blessing. The scripture says Job lived 140 more years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. He died old and full of days, not just in years, but in meaning. Every day was a testament to redemption. His story was not one of loss, it was one of divine transformation. What Satan tried to destroy, God multiplied. But don't mistake this as a fairy tale ending. Job was never restored to erase the pain, but to prove the power of perseverance. His scars remained, but so did his worship. His memory of loss didn't disappear, and that was enough. Yet behind the curtain, the truth was clear. Faith had won, heaven had been glorified, and hell had been silenced by the endurance of one righteous man. At the heart of Job's story is a truth most people spend a lifetime avoiding. Real faith isn't proven by comfort, but by crisis. Anyone can believe when the sun is shining, when prayers are answered, when life feels fair, but when heaven goes silent and the ground breaks beneath you, what remains? That's the test. And that's why Job's story is still told, because he didn't just survive, he stood. Job teaches us that faith is not a bargain with God, it's a bond with God. His trust wasn't based on blessings, it was rooted in relationship. Even when the blessings vanished, the relationship held. That's rare, that's sacred, and that's what made Satan tremble. Job loved God not for the gifts, but for the giver. This is the ultimate lesson. True faith can't be bought, and it won't break under pressure. Job lost everything, yet he never lost his voice of reverence. He argued, he questioned, he grieved, but always facing God, never walking away. That kind of integrity is what shakes the heavens. It's not about being perfect, it's about staying present in the pain. In a world obsessed with results, Job reminds us that God values endurance. Not just outcomes, but obedience. Not just miracles, but maturity. His story doesn't explain every pain, but it reveals what pain can produce. A heart refined, a soul awakened, a faith that no storm can kill. And that's more powerful than gold. Even today, countless believers walk through seasons that feel like Job's: unanswered prayers, deep losses, silent nights. And yet, the story whispers, you are not forgotten. Heaven sees, heaven waits, heaven trusts. If Job's faith could shine in ashes, yours can too. You are not alone in the fire. Job's life is a living altar to what happens when we cling to God, not for what He gives, but for who He is. And that's the lesson Satan never understood. That's why he lost. Because in the end, Job's wealth was restored, but his soul was reborn. His suffering didn't destroy his faith, it deepened it. And that made him truly unshakable. So what if your storm isn't punishment, but preparation? What if the silence is not rejection, but trust? What if your struggle is not meaningless, but part of a heavenly conversation you can't yet hear? Like Job, you may not get all the answers, but you can become someone hell fears and heaven applauds. Now that you've seen Job's entire journey, his rise, his ruin, and his redemption, let me ask you something personal. What is your faith built on? Is it anchored in results or in relationship? Because when the blessings disappear, when the silence stretches long, when the pain hits deep, what remains is what's real. Job's life wasn't just about loss. It was about proving that unshakable faith is possible, that you can question God and still honor Him, that you can cry and still believe, that even when you don't understand the why, you can still trust the who. This is the lesson the enemy never expected and still doesn't know how to stop. Maybe you're in a storm right now. Maybe heaven feels distant. But what if, like Job, you've been chosen, not for punishment, but for purpose? What if your endurance is exposing the lies of darkness and revealing the power of real faith? That's not weakness, that's legacy. So don't give up. Your scars may be sacred. Your silence may be strategic. And your story, yes, your story, might just be the proof that someone else needs to believe again. Let Job's journey remind you, God sees, God speaks, and in time, God restores. Share your experience in the comments, like this video, and activate notifications so you never miss another deep revelation from the Word. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of a stronger, bolder, deeper walk with God.